Welcome to the IONS podcast. I'm Cam Dales, president and co-founder of Peak Energy, and I am absolutely excited to introduce our guest today, an old friend of mine, someone who I consider to be one of the old hands and perhaps one of the most accomplished scientists in the battery space. He's been in the industry for a few years now. Good friend of mine. I think we've known each other for certainly over 15 years now. So without further ado, let me introduce Venkat Srinivasan, Dr. Venkat Srinivasan, who is an important leader at Argonne National Lab, arguably one of the most important labs in the battery space worldwide. So Venkat, welcome to the pod.
Thank you so much. This is going to be a lot of fun, I think. And as Cam was saying, we've known each other I was thinking about this since 2008. That is my guess.
I think that's right.
I'm not happy about being referred to as old and being around for a long time, but that is actually...
Well, you were probably like 6 years old back then, right?
Well, yes. Thank you. I appreciate that. So, I was thinking about this. In August, it'll be 30 years since I came to the United States. 30 years that I've been working on batteries. That is how old I am. So, but I started when I was 3, like you said, or maybe 6.
Amazing. Maybe just start off, if you could just give an introduction to yourself. What are you doing at Argonne? Why is Argonne important? And actually would ultimately like to dig a little bit into the National Lab system and the history that represents. I think it's an amazing history. So, but please start off and just give us a little bit of a background on yourself and how you ended up in the battery space.
Yeah, so I was sort of kind of lucky in terms of what has happened to my career. Went to school in India, got an undergraduate in electrochemical engineering. So I'm an electrochemist, electrochemical engineer by training. Essentially, that means any electron transfer reaction at an interface would be an electrochemical reaction, and I study those things. Turned out that during those days, there were a couple of things you could do. You could work on storage, so batteries, if you were an electrochemist, or you could get into the plating industry, so electroplating, copper deposition, things like that. So I came to the United States to get a PhD in the University of South Carolina, and I was in the battery side of things.
Can I interrupt you just for a second? Yep. So one of the things that I've found to be quite amazing is the dramatic talent that we find in India, and in particular, certain parts of India around electrochemistry. Some of my co-founders at Innovix come from that training and background, and many important scientists in the world on electrochemistry. Why is that?
Yeah, so I actually, and along with some of your co-founders in Innovix, came from a national lab in India, a lot like Argonne National Lab, except that in India, all the national labs are what is called single purpose, meaning they do one thing. And the national lab I came from had its expertise in electrochemistry. So all of us got a bachelor's degree focused on electrochemistry. And guess what? In the world, if you look around, and this is going back 30 years ago, but probably still true today, people need electrochemists, right? People who understand how reactions occur, how does a battery operate, how do you charge a battery fast? All of that was a training that we got. So for many professors who were looking for graduate students, they looked at the school and they were like, oh, wait, here are all these people that have got 4 years of solid training thinking about the subject.
So interesting.
Why not get them as opposed to getting somebody else and then training them for a couple of years? I know every field, you're a mechanical engineer, if I remember this correctly, every field has its jargon, right? The way we talk is a little different. Here are people that knew all the jargon by the time they showed up, and they understood many of the the underlying concepts. The foundation was strong, so we could build on it. That's the reason why many people in the the southern part of India, this particular institute was in the southern part of India, you will see a lot of those people focused on the electrochemical side of things. And in the battery community today, you see a lot of those people that over 30 years have kind of moved and gone up the chain, become founders and become CTOs and things of that nature.
Yeah. No, that's an amazing history. I didn't really realize the why, but I've absolutely noticed just the concentration of folks who are coming from that institute. So shout out to all the battery professionals out there. If you're looking for great talent and you're looking for a place to make some investments, I think it's a wonderful part of the world when it comes to electrochemistry. So sorry, I interrupted you. So you came for your PhD here in the U.S. and
but you make a choice.
Decided
PhD.
decided to make the really poor decision to focus your career on batteries.
That is exactly what happened. I could have done electroplating. Essentially, what happened was all the people that went to electroplating ultimately either moved off into sort of the semiconductor industry doing things that had nothing to do with electrochemistry, or guess what? They moved to batteries because they saw the light in the end of the tunnel and realized that batteries were a far more sort of interesting and richer area to go into. I'm sure all my electroplating friends are going to kill me for that statement, but the reality was that there were really a couple of choices, right? So I went down the path of batteries. I sort of fell in love with research. I really, frankly, when you go through undergraduate and all of that, there's a lot of the kind of the, you have to learn this and you have to learn that, and you don't really know whether you really want to do research, right? Because it's not quite explored that much, especially in India. It wasn't sort of an integral part of what we were exploring. I come to grad school and all of a sudden, I just loved the whole idea of sort of trying to understand something, trying to figure out what others did not figure out before you. Could you do that? That challenge was huge. So I went down that path, got a PhD, and then I went to Penn State first for a postdoc. I really didn't want to get a job, I guess, so I just wanted to continue doing research. So postdoc felt like the kind of the way to do it. And then for the longest time, I always wanted to work for this particular person at the University of California, Berkeley. He's retired now. His name is John Newman. I call him the father of electrochemical engineering. I call Charles Tobias, for those of you keeping count, who is John Newman's mentor, the grandfather of electrochemical engineering, just to kind of make sure that I...
So that would make you the son of electric.
Well, let's go a couple of more generations just because I want to be considered young in this podcast. So maybe a grandson or something. There are various people that Kelp had in between. So they were there in between. So I really wanted to work for John Newman. And so I was lucky enough to get a postdoc offer working with him. So went to University of California, Berkeley, Lawrence Berkeley for a postdoc. And then after a couple of years, they had an opening at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab for a scientist working on sort of mathematical modeling of batteries. So my own research is computer simulations. I do a lot of math on battery modeling and things of the nature. So I was lucky enough to get that job, went into Lawrence Berkeley, and over time, I sort of went up the R&D management ladder. And at some point, I used to run the battery program at Lawrence Berkeley, then got recruited to come to Argonne National Lab. I think as you were mentioning before, Argonne is kind of the big lab for batteries. So here I run a center on batteries. I run a couple of other programs related to that and coordinate all the activities related to energy storage at Argonne. Mm-hmm. That's the quick and dirty trajectory from sort of a grad school days to sort of...
So are you still a scientist in your own mind, or are you just a bureaucrat now?
No, actually, I still spend 50+% of my time doing science. Whether I do it myself is a question you could ask yourself. I have postdocs who actually do the science, and I sort of pretend that I guide them, I point them, and then they go in the opposite direction, and everything works out. So
amazing. That's the way it operates.
Amazing. But I do, I completely enjoy. As one of my friends was telling me this week, he said, he said something like, "You have way too much fun doing science. That's why you're not going up the kind of the corporate ladder, if you will." I would not survive on the corporate ladder either. But no, I sort of have always tried to balance it. I think it's because I think it's important to be in the weeds of things sometimes, because you kind of get to appreciate how difficult things are, but you also get to understand where you got to pivot and move. For example, everything now, all the time we talk in my group about AI and machine learning.
Right.
That is the latest thing that is happening. And if you are a computer modeler, or even if you're not a computer modeler, you better figure out how to incorporate AI, ML into the work that you're doing. And unless you're in the weeds, you won't kind of have the reason to take the time to do that. And so I love being in the weeds sometimes, just because it forces you to think through this and ultimately kind of think about a way to kind of put that all together. So
yeah, it's great. And definitely want to pull on that string a little bit further around kind of the impact of AI, particularly in the science aspect of things. There's a lot of hype happening out in the, let's call it in the VC community around scientific superintelligence and using AI to discover materials. I have a background. One of my first companies was a material science company, Symix, that really pioneered kind of high throughput experimentation, and then was at the very beginning maybe of machine learning. So let's come back to that. But I wanted to ask you, so you quite rarely, I would say, in the academic community, or at least in the national labs, took a detour for some short amount of time, a year or so, took a leave of absence, which I think at the time was considered to be a brave thing to do. And you really bureaucratically sort of push the envelope there and came to one of my last companies, Novix, at the time called Microzier, and spent a year with us as we were really trying to put together the foundations of how do you make a different cell architecture. Could that be used for silicon anodes, et cetera? What was that experience like, and why did you ultimately choose to go back to the lab?
Yeah, frankly, that was probably one of the best things I ever did. So as you were mentioning, I took a sabbatical from Lawrence Berkeley, and I was told during the time when they were granting me the sabbatical that I might have been the first person to do it. I still refuse to believe that.
Yeah, because
that's what I was told.
Why would you want your national lab scientist to actually have industrial experience? That would be really, really dangerous.
I actually got into a meeting with somebody who was an incredible supporter of mine in this endeavor, who said he was getting a lot of pushback because people were worried that I would use it as a way to just leave the lab. And I had to point out to them, if I wanted to leave the lab, I would just leave anyway. But the lab should have the guts to be able to send somebody for a year, because they should trust themselves to be good enough in what they do, or the best in what they do, that people want to come back, right? So that turned out to be the right way to think about this. And that's exactly what the person I spoke to said. He said, you're absolutely right. Go do it, because I think you will find out that you will miss R&D a lot. And that's basically what happened. But, look, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me, right? I mean, you know the story very well. So, this was when Novix was getting formed, or Microzier was getting formed. And just so all of you know, Microzier is because a bunch of the founders were from IBM. That would be blue. Azure is, I guess, a shade of blue. Microzier would be little blue instead of big blue, hence the name.
So we were a bunch of marketing geniuses back then.
Exactly. So I think I was employee number, I want to say 6 or 7 or something. I can't quite remember exactly. Before that, I had worked closely with a couple of the peak founders, sort of helping with the VC pitches. I had actually done a mathematical model for the 3-dimensional cell in Excel. I just laugh about it because it's one of those things where these mathematical models were thinking about things like energy density, certainly not about cost or manufacturability. In retrospect, all that sounds so naive and sort of not thought through. But hey, I think that naivety seemed important I've always thought naivety is very important in the world of sort of R&D, but also in the world of entrepreneurship, right? You kind of want to go into this without, if you kind of think too deeply, everything gets to be, may sound like a dead end, and you need a bit of optimism. So I say this jokingly, but I mean, the reality
is true. And there's a corollary there on the investing side too. I mean, I think it's a relatively well understood principle where the people who are the most experienced in a certain field, if you are the founder of PayPal, you probably will never make another investment in a payments company, and you'll miss Stripe and every other payments company that has done incredibly well, because you just know all the problems and why it won't work. Right.
I know exactly what you're saying.
Your point about naivete is really well taken. I think it's true maybe across multiple fields. I mean, you're pointing to science and as investing, and that may be true in other things. On the other hand, you can get into big trouble being naive.
Yeah, there is a balance. You don't want to be yeah, you're probably right. You don't want to be in the completely, I'm a novice, I have no idea what I'm talking about. I want to defy 4 laws of physics by the time I finish.
Right.
The other extreme is, I see.
But maybe it's the beginner's mindset, really, is what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I know this, any scientist has to be optimistic, right? Because there is so much work that is being done, and there are so many other people doing things. It can be overwhelming. But you know that you are capable of doing something remarkable and better in the sea of other things that are happening that are also remarkable and very good. So I think, entrepreneurship seems to have that same idea, right? And I distinctly remember this. We were doing all these mathematical models. This was, for those of you who don't know, Harold Rust, Ashok Lahiri, Murari Ramasubramaniam, and I were sort of doing various things at the time. And there were a couple of others, Bob Spotnitz. So, and at some point, I remember some announcement from some company, which if you're in the battery community today, every week there is some announcement from some company that has changed the world. And so there was some announcement from some company about changing the world, and all of us being super confused of what does that mean? I'm looking at my spreadsheet, wondering, what can change in this model? All seemed very naive in retrospect. And I think it was one of the people, I can't remember who it was, who said, look, I think it's time for us to go into the lab and actually make something, because all of this is just talk, and it has to be in action so that we learn what is and is not possible. And I thought that was the most refreshing statement that was made, and that is essentially what happened, right? I mean, people went and they did that. And then when I took a sabbatical, I think I was employee number 7 or 8, and it was a lot of fun. I remember everybody had a task, and there were certain things I had to do on a Sunday so that somebody else could do something on a Monday. And it's sort of, you better get that done on a Sunday, because otherwise that person will not know what to do on the Monday morning. And I took that very seriously, and it was fantastic. It was, you could tell why we were working so hard. This was Sunday afternoon. I was sitting down and doing stuff all by myself in a company, because you were going to do something very important. You believed in it, and therefore you were going to spend the time to do it. And you wanted to make sure that the next person coming in had what they needed to continue to push on that mission. That was the first. And the second one is, because we were so small, I remember board meetings where, I was not part of the board, but every one of us knew there was a board meeting that was going to happen the next week. And everybody knew that some stuff had to get done by the board meeting, so that the CEO of the company did not go up there and have to say, we haven't been able to meet this milestone. So therefore you worked for that, right? And so I found that to be really beautiful and fantastic. And just the fact that we were all in it together was just great. I distinctly remember you walking through Innovix during that time. And I think by the time I was leaving, you had procured a used, really old and dirty hot ice sun press, a hip, I think, if I remember this correctly. That's, I think, what you got. Really old, rusted, if I remember this, but it was very
Most
cheap.
Beautiful piece of equipment I've ever bought in my entire career.
And so it was, like I said, but what happened was that I missed the, why does something happen? By the end of that year, we'd actually made a fully functioning 3-dimensional battery which had fingers of anodes and cathodes juxtaposed next to each other with a separator between them. People had talked about it. People had made sort of these naive structures. We had made a completely fully packed structure. The problem was that, there were various things that worked well, there were things that didn't work well. And I was so curious about figuring out what is going on, why was it not working? And some of that is just not what companies should be doing. They should be making a product. And so I started missing the why and the how so much that it was pretty obvious to me that I was a better fit in a national lab. So I'm learning about those things than a product-driven thing, even though, driving a product is, in some sense could be considered more important, right? So it is not a judgment call on what is important as much as what really spoke to me as something that I would want to do. And so going back to Berkeley was, in that sense, an easy decision, but it was a hard decision in the sense that I was missing all the things that I had been doing for the year and change when I was at Innovix. So
fascinating and an incredibly articulate point of view on why do a startup and what's exciting about it. Thank you for that. I always kind of thought you were an idiot to leave the company, but now I have a better insight into why you did it, and definitely respect that around kind of the discovery mindset, right? And you went back to Berkeley at the lab, which is a pretty unique place and kind of a blend between academia and the national lab system. Argonne is a pure national lab, I think. I mean, it has relationships with University of Chicago, I think, and other things. But I'm interested to understand your point of view on why work at a national lab instead of becoming a researcher at one of 1,000, universities. What's unique about that experience? Why are national labs important? If you could touch on the storied history of Argonne, I think it's an amazing story, and we could do an entire series of podcasts on Argonne. I'm sure somebody already has. But kind of draw that thread between the history of how Argonne was founded and what it did and what it's doing now, and why is that important for the country, particularly in the context of like the political environment we're in and everything else, right?
Yeah, so I should just clarify quickly that both Argonne and Berkeley are run by a university, Berkeley by the University of California, Argonne by the University of Chicago. You did say that. I will say there is deeper connectivity with the university in Lawrence Berkeley just because they are right next to each other. University of California is down a hill, and Lawrence Berkeley is up on a hill. Here it's a little bit different. It's in the city of Chicago and the burbs of Chicago, and traffic can be a problem. Let me just back up, right? So National Labs came out of the Manhattan Project, World War II, Argonne, really at the time, there is some debate as to the oldest national lab and the first national lab between Lawrence Berkeley and Argonne. It's a friendly competition. But really what had happened was this was an era where it became obvious that science had to be done in a big way, big science, if you will.
Yeah.
There were big problems. Well, guess what? At that time, the big problem that Argonne took on was Enrico Fermi being the kind of the father of the lab. How do you take the nuclear energy, which clearly, was Oppenheimer. If you've seen the movie, you will see Oppenheimer walking through the University of Chicago stack field, and he sort of sees various people under the kind of the stadium. One of them was Fermi, right? So, but what they were doing in Chicago was trying to take that same nuclear reaction, but try to get useful energy from it, not create a bomb, but to create electricity from it, right? So, big problem. Takes a lot of people to do it. The idea that you can't have a single scientist sort of working all by himself or herself just became clear, right? There are some problems that requires massive infrastructure, a lot of people, so that they can start to kind of work together, do various pieces of this puzzle. You are a very critical wheel in sort of this machine that is running. And if that machine runs properly, guess what? In the end of the day, you have a working nuclear reactor that can give you electricity, right? That was sort of the I guess, the genesis of the National Lab system. The idea that you gotta have to have big science happening somewhere to solve big problems, right? So if you ask me today, right, and I say the story all the time when people come and visit the National Labs, I think of the National Labs as three things. First is that sort of this ethos that you gotta have to have really smart people who are going to be willing to work together, right? That's very critical, right? Who are then going to work on something extremely important, right? So that's the first thing. It's good. Smart people willing to work together on something important. The second one is they're given that mission, a problem that is of significance to the country, to the world, where they can put their brains and energy to go and solve. So, for example, I do that for batteries, right? So that's what always excited me, saying, hey, batteries are super important for a variety of things. We gotta have to go get a better battery in the end of the day. That requires R&D. It's going to take a bunch of smart people coming together, chemical engineers, chemists, mechanical engineers, electrochemists, characterization folks, theorists. They have to work together to do that. Go take the time to do that. That's the second thing, right? Big mission, big problem.
And is that different than the way science is organized at a university?
Depends, right? I mean, so what happens in universities is obviously, your primary purpose is teaching. So therefore, you have a research group where you might be doing a lot of interesting things. You might be collaborating with others who are also obviously adjacent to the research you're doing, and therefore you can pull in bigger things. You can certainly do larger groups, but I've always appreciated the mission-driven way in which we do things in the National Labs, right? Because we are the R&D arm for the country to say, hey, the country needs this big thing to happen. You all go do it. You don't have to worry about graduating students along the way. You don't have to worry about thinking about, what is going to happen in 4 years to your workforce. You shall dedicate your time, sleep on this, wake up the next day, spend your weekends thinking about this big thing, right? And that's something that I've always sort of thought of important. The third thing that I've always enjoyed about the National Labs is it's not just about, you get a publication out or you get patents, and we do both. It's also about reaching out and giving this information to others, right? So, for example, this is a big thing that I talk about all the time. National Labs are in the business of ensuring that companies like yours and many others in the country ultimately go and make products. You make money, you become rich, but along the way, you've also made the world a better place because you've created something that can make the grid more resilient, or you can allow more data centers to be kind of be there without having any sort of brownouts, right? You do that, something big, but we are here to ensure that you get there by providing the R&D infrastructure, taking all of that knowledge, the facilities, the equipment that we have, and the kind of the mission that we've been given to help open the doors for the rest of the kind of the community to come in, use those facilities, use that expertise to kind of go and create great products that people will want to buy, right? So I always thought those are the three things, right? Great people, a big mission, and then you open the door and make sure that others can benefit from the research and the work that you've done. And so to me, that's an ethos that's important.
Yeah. No, I totally get that, and we're a big believer in the National Lab system. Where do you think they fit into the current, kind of political environment? Because by its nature, it's part of the federal government. Therefore, politics are involved. How do you see the lab system, and maybe Argonne in particular? How is the mission changing? Or is it changing?
Yeah, first of all, I should just clarify, right? Most of the National Labs they're not federal employees. For example, I'm employed with the University of California, Argonne LLC, and we have a contract with the federal government. So we are what is called a COCO, a government-owned contractor-operated model. That is just to clarify that, just make sure that.
Yep.
So having said that, right, so again, remember what I said was that our job is we are given a mission and we're asked to go kind of work towards that mission. The mission comes from the President of the United States through the Department of Energy down to us, right? That's kind of the hierarchy in which it comes. And certainly part of the job is to make sure that when the sort of the mission of the Department of Energy changes, we pivot and adapt to that mission, because that is the job when you're sitting at a national lab, because that is essentially what we're paid to do. Go satisfy the mission that is given. And what we're seeing is two things. One, I think there is a lot of support for the national lab system in this administration. If you go and sort of look and see what they've said, I think we've consistently heard, and I'm paraphrasing, the words can change, that the national labs are a national treasure. I've heard this for 30 years, and we continue to hear the exact same thing, because there is something unique about the national labs, right? The kinds of things we are doing is obviously different, right? So, I mean, obviously there's a lot of interest now in fusion energy, in quantum information systems, in AI, and we were talking about AI a little while ago. So the kinds of things we're doing are important. But my sense is that what you will see is that there is a growing interest in making sure that we have a lot of energy. So if you kind of ask, what's the biggest thing that the country is facing today? It's the fact that everybody wants to have an AI data center in every neighborhood. And that's a huge power draw. And depending on who you talk to, it could be, like 25% increase in power requirement in the next 5 years or 10 years, or maybe even less, depending upon how fast this rollout happens. You're going to need all sorts of energy to get there.
Right.
And guess what? We're learning more and more in that example, right? That energy storage is going to play a crucial role. It's going to be a different set of conditions. This is going to be storage that charges fast, charge and discharge, because you're trying to do frequency regulation at a kind of extreme case in some ways. But we thought that, training models sometimes will fail when you're sort of sending them in, because your frequency starts to fluctuate. So storage becomes important. So the problem set will change, because that's the mission, that's the kind of the most important priorities the country has identified. And we as scientists in the national labs are here to pivot towards what the most important things are. So that is kind of the way I've always thought. And that pivot has happened for us many times, right? Because we've gone through many administrations. And so we've been told, hey, this is the most important thing you got to go after. And we go after those new things. But we've always seen, I think, consistently this interest in making sure that the sort of the, what I would call the treasure of the country in the R&D, which is the national labs, are preserved and maintained and sort of strengthened so that we can start to do that on a continuous basis.
That brings up in my mind a question around focus and emphasis within the different markets. I'm on the commercial side, so I think about it in terms of markets. You're more on the science side, so maybe you're thinking about kind of scientific progress, particularly around the differences between grid storage and the other battery applications. Of course, there's been a huge amount of effort both on the scientific side and the commercial side around electric vehicles. Do you see that emphasis changing and maybe pivoting more towards these challenges that you brought up around grid resiliency and just actually growth of capacity, which battery storage could be a big part of that as well? Do you see that as a change in focus? And some ways, maybe, EV technology has reached a level of maturity. Of course, there's always more progress to be made scientifically, but I think it's hard to argue that electric vehicles aren't here to stay, and in fact are on a growth trajectory that may vary in terms of its timeline, but there's no doubt that they will take a large share of the transportation kind of segment, right? How are you thinking about that at the lab?
Yeah, so you're exactly correct, right? EV, it's kind of remarkable to see how many EVs are now on the road compared to even 5 years ago. But certainly, if you go back 10 years, this all feels like a dream today that we are sort of doing all the things we're doing.
We complain that it's only growing at 20% versus 5% predicted, right? But 5 years ago.
Just think back, right? It used to be the Nissan 15 years ago, Nissan Leaf, which went about 70, 80 miles. Or the Chevy, it was like
I was a proud Volt owner.
Oh, or you had to buy a $100,000 Tesla or something, right? And today it's name the company, there's some product to buy. And it's kind of remarkable to see that happening. And you're exactly right? What has happened is with that, you're asking yourself, could I do even better? Can I charge in 5 minutes or 10 minutes? Can I get the cost down to maybe a factor of 2? Because, that's still a lot of people can't afford electric cars. So there are still some challenges, as you're pointing out, but it's not the big, hairy goal challenge that, it was 10 years ago, where it felt like this, whoa, if only we could get this thing, want to completely change the way we think about how we're going to go. Instead, right, even in the transportation world, there is a lot of interest now on things like, eVTOLs, right? Electric vertical takeoff and landing. So these air taxis, which some argue is the kind of the next phase of mobility, especially in urban regions or maybe to urban to suburban, because traffic is an issue and could we do things like this, where some of the same concepts, high energy batteries that oftentimes require high power on discharge because you're trying to land or take off at very high powers, those kinds of challenges are going to become more important, I think. So the nature of the battery tech is going to change especially in the R&D world, as the market matures and some things become obvious while other things have to kind of, are not as obvious. So for example, light duty, maybe all the car companies have a big thinking there. Heavy duty trucking, things like EV tolls can be more complicated. That's where R&D could kick in. But certainly looking at where the data center boom is going, grid resiliency is a huge challenge, right? I mean, it could be just the fact that I'm trying to kind of solve the data center issue we were discussing before, or it could be the fact that I want to make sure that there's a cybersecurity threat somewhere on the grid, that I have redundancy so that I can come in and use a battery storage to sort of make sure that people don't lose power. It could be a hospital. It doesn't matter where. We're going to find out it's important. So that is a incredibly important part of what we are thinking about, certainly what I think a lot of people are thinking about as a way to move forward. I will say that one should never forget military applications, right? I mean, all of the spin-outs of the kind of the EV tech was the fact that a lot of military tech was sort of adapting those same batteries because, these batteries are getting cheaper. People are mass manufacturing them. Defect rates were going down. So then you can start to use them as a way to power your soldiers or start to think about various things that you would do in the military application. So that is always going to be super important, I think. So I think the kinds of things we do will change. But I will also say that, if you think about NMC, chemistry that came out of Argonne, the problem is that we struggle with it today because it's got N and C, the nickel and the cobalt, which is the supply chain constraints. And some people argue lithium is going to be a supply chain constraint. So as we look at these applications that are emerging now, where we would need better batteries, newer tech, we got to kind of think hard about supply chain constraints, I think, very carefully, because if you don't, we're back to square one, same issues. You have to worry about where we're going to get it from. Are these going to be secure? All of that is going to come in. So again, kinds of problem sets will change, I think, but some of the underlying physics probably has to be adapted to that. So.
Yeah, it also feels like if you think about the big trend of battery technology and its development since the invention of the lithium-ion battery and then commercialization back in 1991, for quite a long time, lithium-ion batteries are essentially the only game in town. Right. Definitely different flavors of chemistry, starting off with LCO for very high energy density for, mobile devices and phones and things. And then NMC, little lower energy density, a little lower cost, starting of the EV scale up and revolution. LFP, which obviously has become huge. Again, little bit lower energy density, but very much lower cost and has some really interesting properties in the mobility space. What I think is actually happening is that you're really starting to see full kind of bespoke differentiation between applications, and that you're not going to just have one battery, the lithium-ion battery that does everything. And we built a whole company around this at Peak Energy around sodium ion, and the thing that we're just continually surprised at is how much better in how many different ways this chemistry is for a stationary battery than lithium ion. And it's our perspective that, people have been deploying lithium ion batteries to the grid by default because it's the only thing that's really at scale. But as other chemistries achieve scale, and and as a sidebar, they're able to achieve scale because the grid market is actually now big enough and growing fast enough that it justifies economically pulling some of these technologies out of the lab, right? And then as you look forward into the future, you brought up a bunch of different applications, and maybe it's not going to be just lithium-ion batteries, so whatever the flavor of the month, that are going to be the key technology underlying each of these applications. But I think there's going to be a much wider, diverse set of solutions here that ultimately are tuned specifically for those applications.
First of all, completely agree. For the longest time, we've been kind of saying that, I think just in the community itself, I don't mean the academic community, I mean at large, that we will probably need to have different tech for different applications.
Yes.
And even in the EV world, we've kind of seen that happen.
Yeah.
If we want a long-range EV, get an MC or NCA or something. If you want the standard 250-mile cheap PV, get an LFP battery. And we are seeing those differentiations show up. And I'm completely with you. If you take a step back, the question you asked before, when we think about EVs, we think high energy. You may think fast charging, but you're thinking high energy first, right? You cannot get the driving range to be at a reasonable spot where people do care about sort of taking this as opposed to internal combustion. You think grid, you're thinking the thing is not moving. Energy density matters because, dollars per kilowatt hour, there are some second order effects that are important, not to throw them away. But you're thinking very long life. I don't want to touch this thing for 25 years if I can help it. I want to make sure it's super cheap because I can't ask somebody to pay a ton of money to put a megawatt on installation somewhere. And I'm probably thinking I got to be incredibly safe because I don't want something happening because it's got all sorts of problems. Not that safety can be compromised anywhere, but sort of the metric of what is the most important priority clearly changes, right? So, and then if you take a step back and ask, let's say the world where there was no lithium batteries, what's the ideal battery? You probably wouldn't have picked the lithium battery as the chemistry you would want to go install for every application you can find, to the point you were making. But we did it because, and I saw this happen when I used to live in San Francisco, or I guess near San Francisco. I saw this happen because I used to do a lot of venture capital sort of due diligence and things of that nature. And often what would happen is there'll be some flow battery technology. And what you will find out very quickly is that the utility companies in the business of electricity generation and sending it to people completely reliably, they're not looking for some brand new highfalutin tech that may or may not work and may collapse on them. So when they start asking more questions about the new tech, they figure out that, well, we don't quite know what the warranty is going to be. We don't quite know if it's going to be lasting 10 years because we don't have data yet. And then they start wondering whether this small company is going to be able to survive. And so all sorts of things start to happen. So they go back and just buy the lithium battery from a well-established company and they put it in, right?
Right.
So that was the world we were in before, right? Where that was the easy answer. You just do that. But I think maturity is coming, right? More and more, I think utilities, you're probably seeing this a lot, are now understanding that you probably want something different. They're understanding that, there are ways in which one can do predictions of life that can allow us to kind of think about how to warranty these things correctly. They now understand that maybe as we think into the next 20, 30 years, starting off with a different tech now allows them to start to think about that long-term horizon when new techs can come in. And ultimately, maybe the biggest thing that happened was lithium-ion, especially in the last few years, had such a big supply chain thing because everybody who wanted to buy a lithium battery but taking it into the EV market that nobody else could find cells. So in that mad rush of supply constraints, then you start to sort of think about other tech that could come in. And, I think all of those factors have played a role at various times in the last 4 or 5 years, where I think there's a growing recognition that you probably want to have a bespoke battery for different applications. And you're exactly correct. You probably will find out that it's not a lithium battery. The one caveat to all this is obviously, and you know this very, very well, right? In the end of the day, it is a competitive landscape of different companies. Can you execute? And so a non-lithium battery company has to be able to execute and ultimately, put the products on the ground, be able to show the kind of data they need.
Has to execute and has to be following a worldwide trend of scale. I mean, that was one of the key things that we used to underwrite, starting a company in sodium-ion batteries. Like, there's a lot of, there are a fair probably number of pretty interesting, arguably better chemistry choices than lithium-ion for the grid. But the question is, what's going to get to scale? And how does a battery technology get to scale? It has to start in China in today's world because of the scale that exists there. And so we saw that as a green light to go forward and try and build a company here in the US based on this trend, because we knew that we would be following thousands of companies and mega dollars going into the supply chains that ultimately the world needs to do this thing at a scale that A, matters for the problem, but B, drives the economics so that the theoretical cost can become the actual cost.
Right.
And the second piece of that is you were raising the concerns around technology risk, and for sure the utilities and the IPPs who actually develop the projects are very risk averse in terms of new technology. Although I would argue maybe less risk averse than car companies who have to make a multi-billion-dollar bet and then there's no turning back. Like, you can do smaller projects on the fair side.
Yeah, you're right.
Or even the consumer space where Novix works. Like, it is a very, very large decision to go put something new into a cell phone that's going to sell billion units, right? So it turns out, which is in contrast to kind of my actual belief based on ignorance originally, that I think the grid actually has more opportunities for innovation and sort of risk reduction activities to get a new technology to work. It's less about the risk piece; it's more about the cost, and that brings us back to the scale question. Shameless plug for what we're doing at Peak. We announced this week that we're shipping the first multi-megawatt hour sodium-ion battery to the grid here in the U.S. But it's an interesting model that we'll see whether it really plays out. But I think we're well along the path. Rather than doing pilots with every single utility that basically is the same thing, that they're all trying to prove the same thing, we put together a consortium model where we have a number of IPPs and utilities participating in this joint pilot, which is sort of the first real step to show capability, show reliability, prove the claims in the field that we're showing in the labs. And that leads to then a set of medium-sized projects in 2026, and then success of those then is linked to full-scale projects which start in 27, 28. And I think it's the first time that I've seen a different way of trying to commercialize these technologies in the grid space, and it's a sign of maturity of the IPPs and our sort of our customer partners there. It's also a sign of maturity of the industry in general, where storage has become so important and the pipelines of projects are so large. You're not betting the company or even a fraction of the utility's revenue on something new, and you can do something fairly big without a massive amount of risk. So I personally think like the grid storage market for batteries is the absolute ideal market today. And you used to maybe say maybe it was EVs because they were able to sign longer term contracts, but right now we're at a point where the big IPPs have 90 plus gigawatt hour firm pipelines, and so to start doing things in a few megawatt hours and then even a few gigawatt hours, it's actually not a bet the company type of situation, and it's just really kind of the ideal space.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, I think if you go back even 10 years ago, that maturity wasn't there among grid operators, right? It was all brand new. They were kind of confused about these things. And it became clear to them that maybe it's just a battery that you have to buy, like a lithium battery, a bit like how Tesla started, right? Let's get Panasonic,
let's put laptop batteries in car
batteries, because otherwise we don't know what the hell is going on, right? It makes perfect sense.
It's a great analogy, because now we're putting car batteries on the grid.
Basically, right? I mean,
right. And
think about it.
We should be putting grid batteries on the grid.
On the grid, exactly. And I used to have this when I used to teach battery courses. I used to have this picture of one lithium battery, and then it's the same battery in a car, the same battery in a big installation, because it kind of was the same thing, and it's the same battery in your cell phone and your watch or something, right? So, and I think again, this is why some things you can't rush, and I suspect what has happened is that over the last decade or so, the people that are decision makers in these different utility companies and the PPPs have all sort of looked at various tech, and they've come to the conclusion that maybe there is other things we ought to look at. And I think various companies at various times have had some traction. The company might go away, but I think the education has continued among those people that maybe there is a different way. And that's why I think we're seeing a few companies now, in the sort of the field, in the ecosystem, having success stories, right? They're big, exciting people. They're kind of doing stuff, whether it can be, the Farm Energies of the world, or the Natrons, or you guys. So there are, and I find that to be a great place to be, because what that says is that it's a bit like being in the EV space maybe 15, 20 years ago, where it felt like something different could happen, maybe more like 15 years ago. And I think you guys are sort of trying to sort of exploit that change in thinking and the fact that we are now at a mature spot. And you're right, you have the lower risk of being in a small pilot to test out this particular concept. And if you're able to scale and get to a stage where that pilot can become something bigger and start to sort of have this pipeline impact over time, then I think these companies are going to do really, really well, sort of pushing on kind of getting these grid markets in place, right? So it is interesting. It's taken a long time for us to get there in the grid world, and I think it's kind of great to see that it's happening now.
Yeah, and it's not too late, right? I think one of the things that was shocking to me when we started thinking about starting a company in this space is that we in the battery industry have thought that, grid storage is actually a thing. We've been talking about it for 10, 15, 20 years. And I was just absolutely floored to see that at least 2 years ago, there was less than 2% of the grid batteries needed on just the US grid alone had actually been deployed over the last 15 years.
Interesting.
We're like right at the beginning, even though we've been talking about it forever. There is a huge opportunity in blue space and growth for, I think, multiple different technologies, different companies to get a foothold.
I completely agree.
And then as long as they can get the scale piece right, and you can't do it yourself, it has to be part of a global ecosystem. But if you can get that scale piece right in order to drive the cost down, I think there's room for lots of different technologies to gain a foothold and then ultimately grow into the space. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I used to be one of the RPE awardees from MOVE, must be 15 years ago now, on a flow battery, and we had a student from the Haas School of Business do a sort of a kind of a business plan to see what to do with the tech and how to commercialize it. And I remember like the main guy doing this thing came to my office and he said, "Hey, Venkat, I got to tell you, slow down the R&D. Nobody is ready to actually pick up anything that you guys are doing because everybody's so reluctant." We were all laughing about it, and he was exactly
right.
Years ago. Was just.
I mean, I remember having these conversations with you about how do you crack the chicken and egg around scale for something really, really new. And I'm not sure I have the answer to that. I mean, our answer at around sodium ion is that it's built on the same manufacturing platform as LFP.
Lithium ion, yep, yeah.
Right. So you're not having to deal with that problem.
Right.
We just have a couple minutes left. I would love to hear. You have such a broad viewpoint. You see pretty much everything that's happening in the technology space around batteries, both in the U.S. and overseas. What are you excited about now? And maybe it's related to some of these applications that have different needs than just EVs.
Yeah, I tend to be excited about a lot of things. Many favorite children, I guess. I mean, but I think of things as logical extensions of what we're doing now, right? So if you kind of look at, remember, a national lab, we tend to have a portfolio approach. We work on things that are next gen, but we also work on things that could be 20 years out, right? So I am on the high energy side of things, super excited by sort of things like solid state batteries, because I think they can be a great way to sort of go into a different trajectory of R&D, new materials, new cathodes, the lithium sulfurs of the world, all that start becoming a possibility when you go down the path of sort of these solid state batteries. I'm kind of super excited about that. That's maybe in the long term, that's where I think things will go in sort of the world of high energy systems, or at least I hope things go in that direction. It may take a decade plus to get there, but that's the hope, right? Is that you will get there. I will say that in the same high energy world, and this sort of speaks to the kinds of things you guys are doing, I worry a lot about supply chain. So, we do a lot of work on sodium. We're super excited about sodium because that is in some sense a hedge, but it also has its own unique applications where it becomes useful, right? But certainly from a supply chain perspective, we view sodium as an important part of how the world may want to think about sort of diversifying the kinds of material sets that we would need. And, depending on the price of lithium, we go back and forth on other chemistries. But I think just as a long-term hedge, we kind of need to have multiple chemistries, as we've been talking about. So we view that as very, very important. But the same token, we also view things like, decreasing nickel, decreasing cobalt, so iron-rich or manganese-rich are the kinds of things that we get super excited about, right? I think that's the area of sort of what I would call high energy and supply chains. I am super excited about many things on the stationary storage world, right? So sodium spills over, as you all know very, very well. You could certainly argue, I think, that sodium may make more sense for sort of grid applications and transportation because it's harder to beat energy density wise. LFP are certainly not NMC. So we are taking a crack at those things from an R&D perspective, but our time scale may be longer. But certainly from a grid perspective, sodium makes a lot of sense. I am kind of excited by aqueous batteries. I started my research world aqueous. I was a kind of a water-based battery guy for the longest time, nickel cadmium, nickel metal hydride. I think that space is completely understudied. The more and more we've looked at it, the more and more we feel that there is a whole lot of things to find if you were to just focus on doing things with the protons as opposed to doing it with non-aqueous lithium or sodium ions. If you kind of take a step back and think about it, right? We've discovered new materials for lithium and sodium for the last 30 years. This is the whole game that we've been playing, right? Do we want to use NFPP or NMF, or should we do a solid electrolyte, or is it a liquid? And should we put a layer on top and make it anode free, or should we actually use hard carbon, or should we go to an alloy? That's the game we play. But if you kind of take a step back and ask, what are we doing about aqueous? Most people are still working on, let's use zinc and manganese dioxide, which is a chemistry we've known for 100 years. So let's use lead oxide and lead sulfate and try to make it more reversible. Nothing wrong with that. We can certainly make it more reversible if we can find ways to kind of think about why it's not reversible today. But we haven't played the game of saying, let's go find something that is not.
Yeah.
Nickel, cadmium,
right.
zinc MnO2. And maybe we will find the equivalent of the NFPPs and the anode frees and those kinds of things that we've been playing with. So we are super excited about those kinds of concepts. We think things like AI, machine learning, and kind of the materials discovery that has been coming from sort of what I would call sort of the computational material discovery, but also robotics and all of that. We think are great ways to approach those kinds of problems. So there is a whole trajectory of R&D that I'm super excited by in that. So yeah, many different children. I think we're all of them are exciting, but I view the world in terms of, do you want very high energy and here are some trajectories? Do you want kind of very low cost and stationary, and therefore you go some trajectories? But again, like I was saying, supply chain to me is such an important thing. Kind of have to think about that for all of these, right? So,
yeah, amazing. So for all the budding scientists out there, take it from one of the world's best aqueous batteries. Go for it, guys.
I think it's an important problem. So
before we end, maybe we can wrap it up with the thought we've touched on a couple of times around AI discovery. It's obviously such a big topic in the world, but also in the scientific community. Right. What do you think is the state of the art there? I mean, are we at the stage where you just type a problem into ChatGPT and out pops a brand new battery material, and all you got to do is commercialize it? Where are we?
No, this very well. Obviously not. I mean, look, I think we are scratching the surface on what can we do with AI, right? So things we've seen, right? We've seen people make sort of what I would call these funnels to discover materials using computational methods faster by using AI. So you're looking at sort of trying to figure out, can I, instead of doing that many simulations, can I sort of jump and try to find something faster? We've seen this in automated labs, sort of building on the stuff that you were doing when you were in SIMAC. So it's taking the same robotics, but then doing it so that we are now using that robot to do multi-purpose things. So, the same robot deposits something, takes it to the next station to do some characterization, takes it to a third station to do one more characterization. And then most importantly, closing the loop by using the AI to figure out what set of experiments should the robot do next without a human in the loop, right? That's exciting, but again, early days, right? We're still just about seeing these things start to pop up and see what we can make. My sense is those laws.
I would call that like an AI autopilot. You know what I mean? Or autonomous
driving is what we're calling it.
Yeah, and autonomous driving for material science, where you're still doing all of the physical experiments, but then you're using AI or machine learning to really understand kind of the results, and that's right. And then feedback forward to what to do next. Where are we in terms of like pure in silico, calculation, computer based discovery? Where there's there's a lot of big claims out there. I'm a bit skeptical on it myself. Not that I'm a chemist, but know a lot of very smart chemists who've made a bunch of mistakes trying to discover materials in within the software environment, and then hit the real world afterwards.
So I am on the Kool-Aid side of these things. I don't do that myself, but I'm on the Kool-Aid side. So again, I think what we've seen this at least for a decade, right? The idea of computational material discovery, where let's take a battery material as an example. You would say, okay, let me look and see if the voltage is in the right place so that I don't oxidize the electrolyte, or it's so low in voltage nobody cares. Right. And then I'm going to go see how much lithium or sodium can I hold in this material. If it's like 100 milliampere per gram, nobody cares. If it's 150 plus, then I care. So I'm going to go take that. Then we've also started asking ourselves questions like, is this going to be stable? Is it not going to be stable? Is it going to do something that is really bad? We've asked then questions like, will ions actually diffuse in the material, or will it just be so slow that nobody can even charge these things in a reasonable time? Those concepts have been around for, a decade, right? So I think some of that, the pipeline of sort of making that faster using AI to sort of get that to go faster, all of that is there.
Yeah.
Now, some arguments have been made, and this is not a wrong one, saying, what have you discovered because you've done that? The argument I've always made is maybe there wasn't a material to discover to begin with. I mean, just think about battery materials, right? It's not like there are millions of that and we're all sitting here saying we've only discovered three. It could be true. We got to find faster ways to run through the materials that we're looking at so that if they don't work, they don't work, we fail fast and we move on, right? So I think these tools allow us to do that a lot faster. That is not to say they're perfect. There are many structures that these materials can't find. Amorphous materials are hard to do, for example, right? So again, all you're doing is first training your intuition so that you sort of are thinking better about what could be possible structures, and eliminating things that may not be that useful so that you're narrowing down where your mind share goes, right? So I'm a big fan because of those things.
Right.
So, will we find something new? I think we found examples of that. There are actually examples out there in the patent literature of some new battery materials that have come from these kinds of efforts. I think more and more of that is needed for us to be able to sort of go after what kinds of problems we have to go after in the future. So I'm a fan of that. I will say that where we're seeing real impact also, kind of using the same AI, but not in materials, but also in things like cycle life prediction, right? So you can, with all the big data that's coming, this is something that every company is starting to do. And certainly we have big projects thinking about these things. How could you now predict life? And the big problem has always been, can you take 6 months of data and give us 15 years life? The answer used to be, well, I can't quite do that. Maybe I can do it in 2 years of data. It'll be better if it's 3 years. It feels like now you can start doing that in months as opposed to years to be able to make those predictions. And, imagine what that could do, right? To the, this very, very well, right? As batteries get better, it takes longer and longer and longer for your cycles of learning, right? And so, these kinds of tools are going to help us go faster so that we can start to figure out what is it that any change we do in the lab is doing to that metric of that is so minute to sort of kind of, maybe a small change in some metric, say Coulombic efficiency or something that often we have to wait for a long time to figure out what the implications are. But now can we use these tools to sort of accelerate some of that, right? So I am excited about it. I mean, it's going to help with warranty when it comes to installations, right? I have friends in solar industry that used to tell me, solar leasing was the biggest thing that happened to all of the solar industry. Why can't we just lease batteries? And the answer was always, because you can't predict the cycle life. It's not bankable. But that is going to change. I'm pretty convinced of that, and it's going to change so that we can start to use these tools to be able to say that this is how long this thing is going to last. Therefore, you can monetize it and think about what the warranty is and what the kind of the bankability aspects would be. So anyway, I'm excited.
Really interesting way to think about it. Maybe it's just not that AI is the end-all be-all and you press a button and out comes the discovery. It's more a set of software-based power tools that go alongside a set of robotic, mechanical-based tools, and then the whole scale-up piece. And it's just really an acceleration of the process of learning.
With the human being the one ultimately sort of in control of sort of doing all of that.
Great, Venkat. Well, let me close by just saying what a pleasure it is to talk to you. I think we could have probably done this for another 3 hours, and maybe we will over a beer next time you're out in the Bay Area. But thank you for being so generous with your time and with your ideas. It's wonderful to have you on the pod.
Thank you so much, Cam. This was a lot of fun. I was expecting it to be a lot of fun. It absolutely was. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here.